The Great Depression. It's 1929. People are dancing the Charleston, living it up, and the stock market is soaring. But then, everything takes a sudden turn. The stock market crashes like an overfilled balloon. Banks fail, and millions of people lose their jobs. Imagine the shock. It's like someone flipped a switch, and suddenly, everyone's broke. The economy doesn't start to bounce back until World War II, when factories rev up to support the war effort. The Latin American debt crisis. Imagine, it's the 1980s and we're in Latin America. Countries like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina are borrowing heavily from international lenders. But then, interest rates in the US shoot up. Suddenly, these countries can't keep up with their debt payments. The result? Massive defaults and economic turmoil. It was like borrowing your friend's car, only to realize you can't afford the gas. The 1970s oil crisis. Imagine it's the 1970s. Bell-bottoms are in style, and disco rules the airwaves. But there's trouble brewing. Oil-producing countries in the Middle East decide to stop selling oil to the West. Prices shoot up overnight. Gas stations run dry, and people start lining up for miles just to fill their tanks. Inflation skyrockets, and the economy grinds to a halt. It's a decade of stagflation, a weird, frustrating mix of stagnation and inflation. Think of it as the economic version of being stuck in traffic with a flat tire. The Asian financial crisis. Asia, late 1990s. Countries like Thailand, South Korea, and Indonesia are booming. But there's a catch. They've borrowed too much money. When investors get jittery and start pulling out, the house of cards collapses. Currencies crash, stock markets plummet, and economies tumble. It's a stark reminder that what goes up can come down fast. The Russian financial crisis. In 1998, Russia faced its own economic meltdown. After years of struggling to transition from a Soviet economy, everything reached a breaking point. The government devalued the ruble and defaulted on its debt. Panic spread, markets crashed, and the crisis sent shockwaves around the world. It was a harsh lesson in the difficulties of economic reform. The dot-com bubble. Enter the early 2000s and the rise of the internet. Tech companies are popping up like mushrooms after a rainstorm. Everyone wants a piece of the action, and stock prices soar. But soon reality sets in. Many of these companies aren't making any money. The bubble bursts, and stock markets nosedive. Investors lose billions, and the economy takes a hit. It's a classic case of too much hype and not enough substance. The 2008 financial crisis. Next up, the 2008 financial crisis, also known as the Great Recession. Picture this: banks are handing out mortgages like candy on Halloween. People buy houses they can't afford, and soon, the housing market collapses. Banks fail, the stock market crashes, and millions lose their jobs. Governments step in with massive bailouts to prevent a complete meltdown. It's a harsh lesson in what happens when greed and poor regulation mix. The European sovereign debt crisis. Following closely on the heels of the 2008 crisis is the European sovereign debt crisis. Countries like Greece, Spain, and Italy face massive debts and deficits. Austerity measures lead to protests and political instability. The Eurozone is shaken, and the future of the euro itself is questioned. It's a tense time, showing how interconnected global economies have become. The COVID-19 pandemic. Our final stop is the COVID-19 pandemic. In early 2020, the world comes to a screeching halt. Businesses close, travel stops, and millions are out of work. Governments around the globe pump trillions into their economies to keep them afloat. It's a crisis like no other, blending health and economic woes into one. While we're still dealing with the aftermath, it's clear that this crisis has reshaped the world in ways we're only beginning to understand.